This video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website or domain, visit squarespace.com. Hey everybody, and welcome to a new video. Do you keep hearing the term crop factor and wonder what it means? While many people understand what it means in focal length, should you apply the crop factor to aperture? There are tons of misunderstood or nuanced definitions out there, including one called equivalency. In this video, I'll explore how crop factors and sensor size affects your camera settings and what the resulting photo looks like. And I warn you, not everyone agrees on this, so the comments section will be busy. Hang around for my bonus tip, where I'll answer the question, can ISO be impacted by the crop factor? My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for wildlife and nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Okay, let's start off with a physical description of what's going on here. Camera sensors come in various sizes, with the ones close to the size of 35mm film called full frame at 36 by 24mm, like in my Canon R5 or R8. 24 by 16mm is called crop or APS-C, like on my Canon M50 or 7D Mark II, a bit smaller on other brands, and micro four thirds at 17 by 13mm, like in Olympus and Panasonic cameras. How do these sensor sizes affect the photo you get? First off, your lens doesn't project a rectangular image into your camera. It projects an image circle into your camera from which your sensor records a rectangular section to capture your photo. Some people mistakenly believe that crop sensor lenses shrink the image to fit a smaller sensor, or full frame lenses have images stretched to fill a larger space in your camera. Rather, large sensors like full frame capture a large rectangular shape from the image circle. A smaller sensor captures a smaller crop of that image circle, so they don't catch all of the scene that a larger sensor does. So this light on the outside here is lost. While a crop sensor captures the same light intensity as a full frame, i.e. light per square centimeter, a full frame captures more total light, which gives them a low light advantage for image quality in what's called a better signal to noise ratio. Same intensity of light, but a larger area, meaning more total photons collected. This will be helpful to know later on when we discuss the impact of crop factor on aperture. So the crop sensor captures a smaller slice of the scene, and of course when we view it on our devices or monitors, we fill the screen and the crop sensor image appears to be magnified. See here, the crop sensor has captured a smaller slice of the scene that looks bigger when viewed. We call this magnification the crop factor. A full frame, which becomes the standard when calculating crop factor, would look like this. A crop sensor looks like this, and the difference in size is described by a crop factor of 1.5 for APS-C, or 1.6 on a Canon, and micro four thirds like this, described as a 2 times crop factor. But note, if I zoom into the APS-C sensor image to the same field of view as the full frame, the background isn't blurrier on the full frame. Thinner depths of field from full frames comes from getting closer or using longer lenses to have the subject the same size. And those two are what create thinner depths of field, not any characteristic the sensor has that changes the image. So the crop factor can then be applied to calculate the equivalent field of view for smaller sensors compared to the full frame. Like a 32mm focal length on my full frame would be the equivalent of a 20mm focal length on a crop sensor. 32 divided by 1.6 is 20, or 16mm on a micro four thirds. If I shoot my Owl Buddy with a 20mm lens on my APS-C sensor camera, I'll get the same field of view as the full frame at 32mm. Okay, effective focal length was easy. What about aperture? How is that impacted by the sensor size and crop factor? We're getting into something called equivalency here, a contentious topic. For some genres, getting equivalent photos means the same amount of light. Other genres, equivalent distance to the subject. Others, equivalent depth of field is more important. So the way you think of this varies by genre. And in all of this, note that the aperture isn't really changing. These are just equivalencies so we can compare things. For example, if we look at our previous photos, there's an issue. In many types of photography, the size of the subject in the frame is often a critical piece of the photographer's toolkit and artistic approach. But to get the same size of the subject in the crop sensor as the full frame, I need to use a shorter focal length or stand farther back. So I can change this zoom lens to be 20mm rather than 32mm from the same distance which I shot on the full frame. But using shorter focal lengths makes the depth of field deeper and you get less background blur. You can look here for my video on why that is, but make sure you come back. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you're going out every day to take beautiful images, they deserve to be shown off in the most flattering way possible. A website is just a great way to show off all of the details in an image and show your photos the respect they deserve given how much work you put into them. I built my own website using Squarespace and it was easy. Lots of useful templates, including ones for specific genres like photography. Or start a completely personalized website with the new guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, for a personally curated layout custom built for you from the ground up. A website is also a great way to monetize your work by setting up an online store so you can take payments by credit card or PayPal from all over the world. And a great new feature, offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with a flexible payment option. Go to squarespace.com to sign up for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Simon for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So we've matched the field of view of the full frame, but not the depth of field, which can be an important attribute to some photography genres. How do we fix this? We apply the crop factor to the aperture 2 and use this new aperture setting to get an equivalent image. If we shoot my owl buddy at the same distance, but instead of 20mm f4 we use 20mm f2.5, 4 divided by 1.6, we get the same field of view as the full frame and the same depth of field, like in this comparison. If you see here, if I calculate the depth of field of these two shots using photopills, I get the same result. So when you want to calculate equivalent depths of field, you apply the crop factor to the aperture. So when you have a micro four thirds 25mm f1.4 like this Panasonic Leica, it doesn't create the same depth of field as my Sigma Art 50mm f1.4 on my full frame. You need to apply the micro four thirds crop factor of 2 times to both the focal length and the aperture, giving it the same field of view and depth of field of a 50mm f2.8 lens. But note that while I applied the crop factor to the aperture for the depth of field calculation, you don't apply it to the aperture for the exposure calculation. f2.5 on a crop sensor will not give you the equivalent exposure as full frame at f4. I had to increase the shutter speed to make the brightness equal on the two images. To clarify this, if you're photographing a mountain in the distance at f8 with your full frame and you say to yourself, I'll swap out my full frame and pull out my crop sensor from my camera bag and use that for a bit more reach, you use the same f8 and the same settings for ISO and shutter speed to get the same exposure. f8 is the same on all sensor sizes. So with the right lens selection and settings, you can get a roughly equivalent look to a full frame with a smaller sensor, but only to a point. My 50mm f1.4 here is a great lens and gives me a thin depth of field that looks really nice to create great background blur. But on an APS-C size sensor, I'd have to use a 30mm f0.88 lens, not something you often see kicking around the camera store. In fact, it doesn't exist. So while we can play around with lens selections and settings on smaller sensors to get equivalent results to full frames, not all scenarios are able to be made equivalent. But you may be saying this is nice to know, but how does it affect my photography in real life? It depends on the genre you shoot. For example, you want to get into shooting real estate, where you need to capture a wide view of a room to make it look its best. When you ask a friend what lens should I get for real estate photography, the answer may be 15mm may get you a nice wide angle on a full frame, but if you shoot on a crop sensor camera, you need an ultra wide 10mm lens to get the same wide field of view. Before I move on, any practical tips or something critical I didn't mention in this video? Let us know. Remember, none of us are as smart as all of us. Now a really tricky one. Do you apply the crop factor to ISO? Rather than a direct mandatory correlation, I'm going to say that ISO can be affected by the choices the different size sensors force the photographer to make. For example, earlier we noted that to get the same field of view and depth of field as a full frame, smaller sensor cameras need a shorter focal length with a wider aperture. In my earlier examples, the wider aperture f2.5 made the image brighter than the f4 shot on the full frame. As such, to balance the exposure to the same brightness, I increased the shutter speed. But there's another choice. In the field, I might have lowered the ISO because I didn't need the extra shutter speed. It turns out that to apply the crop factor to ISO, you apply the crop factor squared. So ISO 1000 on my full frame shots becomes 1000 divided by 1.6 squared, which is about 400 on APS-C, 250 on Micro Four Thirds. So by using faster glass or wider apertures on a smaller sensor, I've given myself the opportunity to get a lower ISO. Turns out when I compare the ISO 400 image taken on a crop sensor to 1000 on a full frame, the noise is starting to look very similar. So you can close the noise gap on sensor sizes if you have the right lenses. But to note, no one goes around calculating equivalent ISOs in their photography. Just use large aperture lenses when you can and enjoy the benefit of the lower ISOs that you get as a result when used with smaller sensors. So that means with lenses with wider apertures used on smaller sensors, you can not only get equivalent depths of field, but similar noise performance with smaller f-stops. But why then do professionals often favor full-frame cameras if we can get the comparable results with smaller sensors? Sometimes it's so that we don't have to compromise with equivalency limitations, and also that full frames often have build quality and other features like 2-card slots and weather sealing that we desire, as well as high quality but expensive lenses. As for image quality, the full frame may still often be better. The image doesn't need to be stretched as much to fill the screen, and larger sensors can have benefits like dynamic range that are also helpful. And does this mean you shouldn't get a crop sensor or Micro Four Thirds, or that I'm putting them down given I shoot full frame? Not at all. Great reach, often with densely packed pixels, small size and weight, and lower prices make them a great choice for many. And there are pro quality models in there as well. The goal here is not to make you lust over what you don't have, but understand how to use what you do. Just save some budget for fast lenses to make them their best. And now you even know why you should, not just that you should. Just get out there and take some photos. If you found this video deserving, please give it a like and YouTube will show it to other photographers trying to understand how crop factors impact their photography. And I hope you can use this to go out and get your own amazing and unique photos the very next time you go out. I know you can do it.